Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special coverage on the latest developments in the Zionist entity. Here's what's new. The Zionist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dismissed Defense Minister Yoav Gallant a day after he spoke out against the country's planned judicial reforms. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, a senior member of Netanyahu's Likud party, became the first to break ranks late Saturday by calling for the legislation to be frozen. Gallant cited the turmoil in the ranks of the military over the plan, but it was unclear whether others would follow him. In a brief statement, Netanyahu's office said the Prime Minister had dismissed Gallant. Netanyahu later tweeted, "We must all stand strong against refusal." Gallant tweeted shortly after the announcement that the security of the state always was and will always remain his life mission. The internal situation in the Zionist entity has become a focus of attention, with everything pointing to the Zionist entity being in a serious crisis, which, in the view of many analysts, could lead to the state's collapse. Due to the damage to the Zionist capacity for deterrence, there are attacks being planned, according to internal speculations, on the assumption that the country is paralyzed. Gallant had reportedly voiced concerns that the division in society were hurting morale in the military and the embodiment of Zionist enemies across the region. Thousands of protesters took to the streets of Tel Aviv on Sunday, blocking a main highway following the announcement. The move signaled that Netanyahu will go ahead this week with the overhaul plan, which has sparked mass protests, angered military and business leaders, and raised concerns among the country's allies. The package of reforms sought by Netanyahu's religious nationalist coalition has triggered weeks of unprecedented street demonstrations and stirred worries among Western allies who see a threat to the independence of the Zionist justice system. It will take more than one individual to lead the country out of its current impasse. To do so, it is going to take key members of the coalition, as well as responsible members of the opposition and leaders of the mass protest movement, whose genuine concern is the democratic nature of the state, not overturning the results of the last election. Netanyahu's government is pushing ahead for a parliamentary vote this week on a centerpiece of the overhaul, a law that would give the extreme right governing coalition the final say over all judicial appointments. We will delve into debate shortly after this. Hello again. Let me welcome Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, who is a senior correspondent of the Royal Palace from the UK. Hello, Miss, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Welcome.
So how do you read the statements that see Prime Minister a threat to the security of the Zionist entity?
Well, this is probably the biggest crisis facing Tel Aviv since the Nakba. It really has plunged Israel into an escalating political crisis. But it's quite interesting how it is spreading as well, because not only has the defense minister gone, but there are other, not as significant, but still senior resignations. As we're talking now, Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem is under siege. And it's quite ironic. He'll get a little taste of what is daily life for the Palestinians, and that is being trapped in your home, unable to move. So, as I say, that is quite ironic. But a group of universities has just announced that they are going on strike from Monday, so that's in a few hours' time over there. And Israel's Consul General in New York has resigned in protest as well. This democracy, so-called democracy, in the apartheid state is really crumbling before our very eyes, and it will have caused the West, quite a concern.
And since I just would like to underline the so-called democracy here. The Prime Minister was asking that a vote be taken on April 26th. So you can see that there is not even a room within the cabinet for a discussion, a compromise with the opposition for perhaps a more palatable judicial overhaul, let's say, that a larger segment of the Knesset perhaps would approve of.
Well, the biggest thing that focuses the minds of the Zionist state is security. Everything it does, every war crime it has ever committed, every house it's ever bulldozed in the occupied Palestinian territories, it does in the name of security. Now, thousands of reservists are threatening not to report for training in protest against Netanyahu's reforms. So this will send shockwaves throughout the state.
Absolutely. And we see that leaders of the country's vibrant high-tech industry have said that the changes will scare away investors. And former top security officials have spoken out against the plan. And key allies, including the United States and Germany, have also voiced concerns. Where do you think these concerns are stemming from, and what are they pointing to?
Well, it's very hard to know where this is going to end, but, this is a nuclear state on the abyss. And the crowds are quite unprecedented. And they show no sign of abating. And I think that Netanyahu's telephone between Washington and Jerusalem must be red hot at the moment, because there will be huge concern. This is a state which isn't even the size of a South African game park. It has nuclear capabilities. If it can't guarantee its own security, and the military are threatening not to perform their duties,
yes, the discontent has indeed even surged from within the army. The most popular and respected institutions among the Jewish majority, a growing number of Zionist reservists, including fighter pilots, have threatened to withdraw from voluntary duty in the past weeks. What does this mean to the security of the state? Yes, it seems like the internal speculations that this would jeopardize the security is resurfacing and stirring a lot of debates.
Well, the first thing it'll mean to the Palestinians is no more deadly flights coming over their homes, because when the Israelis fly, children, women, and other innocents die. So I would imagine that there'll be quite a degree of schadenfreude in the occupied Palestinian territories. But I would also imagine that a lot of Israeli citizens are also worried about their own security because they rely so heavily.
Yes, how do these judicial changes actually affect them directly, and how does it affect the government that is trying to bring, because they believe, according to polls that were conducted, the people believe this will affect every sector of the society. How so?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the state is, or the government has a fragile coalition at play with a few minority groups that have come together. And all they've done at the moment is foster corruption and damage the economy. And, once you start to hurt people in the pocket, that's when they start to rise up. And we're seeing scenes now that, as I say before, were unprecedented. The Israeli citizens usually rally behind their military and rally behind the government, but not in this case. The head of Yesh Atid, which is the largest opposition grouping, branded the Gallant's dismissal as a new low and called it an insanity, and something that Netanyahu was against doing this, but he ignored his security officials and just went ahead anyway. You have to wonder about the sanity of the man in charge of Tel Aviv at the moment, because politically he's unstable, mentally he's acting like a man who is unstable, and the result of his actions, he's destabilized the whole country.
And Mrs. Yvonne, just a few days ago, the first vote was brought in where the Attorney General wouldn't be able to remove the Prime Minister. And this is a prison who, let's say, right now is on a corruption trial. When we talk about Netanyahu and his, corruption trial resurfacing, and now we see these reforms that even Hebrew media is actually pointing to the fact that the whole state is on the verge of being in a, let's say, a war, an internal war, a civil war, let's say.
Absolutely. Eitan Ben Elahu, who was the former head of the Air Force, said tonight that Netanyahu had declared civil war. These are unprecedented times. And I would imagine that a lot of outside states are looking on with a degree of bemusement at this, because, rarely does Israel attract any sort of global sympathy at all because of the brutal occupation over the Palestinians. So they don't have any friends in the area, and if that country is plunged into a civil war, this will be causing, I can see the strategists in the White House drawing up nightmare scenarios when they least want it, because they're occupied with this war in Ukraine.
Since we see this, let's say, a danger to this state, why are they going to push these judicial overhauls through? And why their ministers have convictions of tax fraud and convictions of racism, and they are just, pushing through this law, disregarding everything, the people who are against these reforms that jeopardize the democracy. And as we see, the Hebrew newspapers now are talking about civil war. Why are they so stubborn into pushing through this judicial reform? Why is it so important to this government?
Well, you just have to look at the history of Israel. Virtually every single leader, before the only female leader, Golda Meir, every other leader has faced allegations of fraud and corruption before. Netanyahu, as you were saying, came very close to trial, but he managed to get it all swept under the carpet by declaring immunity for himself. And that has obviously enraged a lot of ordinary Israeli citizens who are not going to put up with such a corrupt leader who exonerates himself. It's like letting a fox into the chicken coop, and you can see the scenes outside. This is a civil war, and it wouldn't surprise me if there is some sort of military coup to remove Netanyahu, because I feel
So is this really the end of his ruling era, since we see the Zionist entity's government, let's say, political crisis is really widening, leaving no options for him?
Well, the last course of action for Netanyahu is to send bombs into Palestine. That's always his, default position when he's cornered. Except he's alienated the military now and the Air Force, so I don't think he can pick up the phone and pass on the pain to the Palestinians, which is what he usually does. But this, basically, we have this saying in the West about lunatics taking over the asylum, and this is what has happened. You've got all the hardliners in Netanyahu's coalition, the ultra-nationalists, who all pushed and pressed Netanyahu to dismiss Gallant.
Yes, among other Netanyahu's opponents made their feelings quite clear on social media, with the Zionist longest-serving Prime Minister set to make his return to the country's top job after winning an absolute majority in this week's, let's say, in the general election. But now the demonstrators broke through the police barriers toward Netanyahu's house, calling him to resign. Others protested in front of a number of ministers' homes. Where could these protests inside the Zionist entity lead to, according to you?
Well, I think that he will be contemplating his future at this very moment. As I say, it's a delicious irony that he is getting this, he is experiencing just a little bit of the hardship that he's put the Palestinians through on a daily basis. He can't walk out. The people have risen up. When the people start to move, if the leaders don't follow them, the leaders will become irrelevant. And I think Netanyahu is about to become irrelevant. But perhaps the most alarming feature in all of this is that the military will or may flex its muscles and turn Israel into what we already know it is, which is military state.
Very nice. Now we are joined by Pippa Cartel, Professor of History and Policy from the University of Westminster from the UK. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening. Hi, thank you.
So how do you read the latest development within the Zionist entity? And there are a lot of opponents who are tweeting right now that the country is a lost cause. How do you read it yourself?
Well, I think in some ways it's quite early to say. If you look at protests, it's easy to say that they can look terribly impressive. There's lots of flames burning and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean the state is about to collapse. There are, of course, all kinds of processes which can go through before you have a change of government. And as Yvonne's just been saying, there's the question of who is going to support the existing government and so on. So the fact that people are on the streets demonstrating against Netanyahu, not for the first time, doesn't necessarily mean that...
But Mrs. Pippa, the social structure of the Zionist entity already carries the seeds of separation and division. How can this affect the Zionist entity's unity now within the presence of the four tribes, conservatives and extremists? To what extent can this separation affect the government's and people's unity?
Well, I think that as has been said already, one of the things which holds a state together is the military. And that, of course, happens not just in Israel, but in a load of other states. If the military decides to change who they support, then that can lead to a fall of the government, but I don't think we're necessarily at that stage yet, partly because whatever we think of Israel, the idea that it is a democracy, albeit a deeply flawed one, is one which is part of the myth that state presents of itself. So I think that preserving at least some kind of appearance of the rule of law will be important to whatever happens next. And whilst there might be internal conflict politically, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an alternative government ready and waiting in the wings.
But if this is not really that important, according to what you say in Peppa Cartel, why is the West concerned about all these protests and the division inside the country?
Well, why shouldn't they be? I mean, because Israel is seen is a trading partner of the EU. It's one of the major recipients of American aid. And so the West does tend to take an interest in what happens there. And an implosion in Israel, regardless of what the implications for the Palestinians and so on, will have a destabilizing effect within the wider region. So I think there will be a concern in Western governments for what will happen more broadly within the region if you have a disorderly process happening in Israel. And as Yvonne was saying, when you already have a major conflict which is distracting Western powers to the north of there in Ukraine, this is something that the West will probably rather avoid. So it doesn't. I suppose one way of looking at it is it's the imponderables. It's that you don't know what's going to happen, but you'd rather not have to deal with the consequences. It falls within the realm of what Donald Rumsfeld memorably described as unknown unknowns. We can't predict what will happen.
Definitely, but maybe we can speculate on certain points. And here, Mrs. Yvonne, let me ask you this question. If we talk about extremist government, a religious and extremist government that is ruling the country now, perhaps it wouldn't be for the benefit of the Palestinians. Now that there is this division between the Zionist government and the people, how do you think this can actually benefit the Palestinian side?
Well, apart from the obvious delight that their neighbours are suffering, I think that the Palestinians may use this opportunity to speak to the peace brokers, whoever they may be. You know, the Americans are still not trusted. And I think that they would get quite a sympathetic hearing. I think the priority of the US and Britain and Europe will be to try and encourage some sort of stability. But of course, it's going to be difficult because the government controls 64 seats in Israel's 120-seat parliament. So, you know, the elections at the moment have polarized this country. And as I say, you know, we should remember that this is a state that isn't the size of a South African game hall. It's a tiny little country, but this will be causing the Americans much more concern right now than anything happening in Ukraine.
And what about you, Mrs. Pippa Cartel? How do you read this? I mean, do you see the Palestinian side benefiting from this rupture between the people and the current government?
I find it quite hard to see that. I mean, you look at the crowds; they're waving Israeli flags. They're not. They're not. Demonstrating against the state or anything like that. It's
but actually, we do have news that say demonstrators did break through the police barriers and headed towards Netanyahu's home, and they asked him to resign.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely. But that doesn't mean that they're talking about making a major change in the stance of the Israeli state. What they seem to be expressing to me, looking at the huge number of Israeli flags that are being waved there, is that this is about a expression of what they see as Israel, and that they regard Netanyahu, who has been playing the patriotic, in inverted commas, card for a long time, and trying to be a very national, appealing to right-wing nationalist opinion within his country. What they seem to be doing is resisting that and trying to express a different kind of idea of what Israel is about, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take a much more lenient, much more liberal line towards the Palestinian issue than Netanyahu did.
Yes, but then firing people from the government, firing those who criticize the reform plan, doesn't seem something that easy. And here, the latest info we have, the White House highlights recent call with the Prime Minister where Biden raised concern over legislative efforts, stresses importance for checks and balances as bilateral ties deteriorate further. The Biden administration expressed its alarm on Sunday after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over the latter's call for the Hardline Coalition to pause legislation aimed at overhauling the judiciary. Pippa Cartel, how do you read this development? I mean, why is the U.S. concerned over democracy in the country?
Why wouldn't it be? As I said earlier, given the US gives vast amounts of aid towards Israel, of course they're concerned and they feel that they have a reason to take an interest in these kinds of things. The behaviour of Netanyahu towards senior colleagues is obviously destabilising not only the government, but destabilising not only the government but also the country. The point I was merely making is that I do not read the protests as being to overthrow the government, perhaps, but not necessarily to take Israel on a radically different direction. That's all I was trying to say.
Yes. What about you, Mrs. Yvonne Ridley? Do you agree with Pippa Cartel regarding this point? I mean, isn't this deterioration, or let's say this break between the people and the government, going to benefit at least the Palestinians? Maybe we can see these extremist government going away?
I think it will be a sideshow for the Palestinians in truth. And, I think quite a lot of them will be enjoying the moment, especially Netanyahu under siege, which he is at the moment because of all of these Israeli protesters. It would be nice if those protesters turned on Netanyahu for the brutality of his occupation of the Palestinians, but they're protesting because they're being hit in the pocket financially. And that's why they're protesting. They couldn't care less about what's happening in the occupied West Bank or
But then when violence rose, in the West Bank, and there were, let's say, revenge attacks from the Palestinian side, we saw some protests by the Zionist citizens against the government for taking such extreme hardline.
Well, I'm sure if the Palestinians can exploit the situation at the moment, they will. The last few months in the occupied West Bank have been horrendous, especially for the people of Jenin, who have been under siege and having invasions into their town. Anything that stops the brutality of the occupation will be welcomed by Palestine.
So you do read and analyze that perhaps this development is going at least to stall the Zionist government in its plan of settlement in the occupied Palestinian territories?
Well, if the Air Force does threaten to withdraw flights and the reservists threaten to not go on duty, this will severely impact the state of Israel, which is forever going on about its own national security. The biggest threat to Israel at the moment are the Israelis.
What about you, Pippa Cartel? Do you agree that the Zionist entity state is at stake, and when the security is touched, technically we can speak about this state on the verge of collapsing?
I think that's going a bit far. I think, and Yvonne hasn't said anything like that. I think that we can all welcome the difficulties that a very hardline and unpleasant governments have got into, and hope that the result will be that the kind of brutality that Yvonne's just been describing will be lessened. But I can't see Israel as a state collapsing in the near future because of what's going on at the moment. It looks colourful and impressive, but as Yvonne says, they're not protesting against the state as such. They're protesting against the government of that state, and they're protesting against the way in which that government is being run. They're not, as far as I can see, from the flags they're waving and so on, and from what we can gather, calling for a radically different approach to how that state is managed.
Ms. Pippa Cartel, at least, can the current situation be interpreted that the population also fears that Netanyahu wants to leverage the judicial, let's say, push to freeze or avoid his trial on corruption charges, which he denies? He also has denied having any such plan.
Well, yes, I'm sure that's. I'm sure there's something to that, but it's a protest against the prime minister, not against the state. And you can overthrow a government without overthrowing the constitution. You can have a continuity in these kinds of things. Obviously, in a state which is generally understood as a constrained democracy, if you like, normally governments change as a result of an electoral process. And as Yvonne said, given that the government continues to control the Knesset, the protests may not lead to any kind of dramatic change because there's an alternative government would not be able to control the parliament without further elections. And there is, at the moment, no tradition in in Israel for a government to be overthrown through extra parliamentary means. And I don't think that the protesters are expecting that to happen. What they want is for the Prime Minister to resign, but that's not necessarily going to lead to new elections or anything like that.
Very nice. And to enrich the debate further, we're joined live by Mr. James M. Dulce, geopolitical analyst and senior fellow at Middle East Institute in US from Singapore. Hello, Mr., and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. If I can just quickly say one thing in response to the former speaker, or two things. One is, this is unique, or not even unique in Israeli history, but mass protests that change government are a phenomenon that we've seen across the world. The second thing I want to say is, we've had a similar situation in 1982, when you had 500,000 people on the streets after the massacre in Sabra and Shatila in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, that forced the resignation of the government of Menachem Begin, including the defense minister Ariel Sharon. So this is not totally unprecedented. What I think this is, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the longest serving prime minister, if you take the total number of years that he has been in office, has always had a very good sixth sense of what public opinion is. This time he has really fundamentally miscalculated and is now in a bind.
And as Mrs. Yvonne Dosely, Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, let me correct that, spoke about earlier, she did mention that Netanyahu always creates a diversion, let's say, to the current challenges in the country. But how do you read this yourself, Mr. James Dulce? Do you really see the Prime Minister a threat to the security of the Zionist entity, since we've been debating this for quite a while?
Well, the fact that there is unrest in the military and that members of the military have been willing to go as far as to say that they would not serve at this particular moment in protest against a proposition of the government, that is unprecedented. And of course, it lowers readiness if you don't have all of your pilots in place, or whatever function it is within the military. That reduces readiness. And as such, potentially that is a security threat if any one external party would want to exploit that situation. It's highly unlikely that any of Israel's neighbors, or even Iran, or whoever it may be, is really going to try and do anything. But as a matter of principle, yes, it reduces security.
But seeing all this opposition, Mr. James Dulce, why is this government so stubborn about pushing through these reforms? I mean, it's going to be taken on April 26, and there is no room even for debate, I mean, within the cabinet for any discussion.
I think that there are two reasons. One, I want us to keep in mind that this is the most far-right government that Israel has ever had. And you have a phenomenon that Israel, in a sense, has inherited or taken over from the United States, where you have an activist, far-right, libertarian think tank that is extremely well-funded, and that takes an activist attitude towards what it does. With other words, it doesn't simply issue reports. It actively lobbies for implementation of those reports. And a number of key members in this far-right government are adherents to what that institute is proposing. And so this legal reform really comes out of that institute, the Kohelet Institute, which is funded primarily by high net worth individuals in the United States. who also back the right wing, the Republican Party, and particularly the more conservative elements of the Republican Party in the United States.
And how do you read the stance of the United States?
Just to finish, there's the element, of course, which the other speakers have pointed out, which is Netanyahu's personal legal situation, in which he wants to squash whatever corruption charges there may be against him.
So he's trying to create a diversion again, at least against the corruption charges. But then how do you read the latest info that Biden actually, over a phone call with the Prime Minister, he raised concerns over the legislative efforts and also stressed the importance for checks and balances as bilateral ties between the two countries are deteriorating according to analysts. Do you have the same vision, Mr. James Tulsi?
Well, first of all, I don't see what the diversion is here. The conflict, the dispute is over the legal reform. It's not over something that Netanyahu is trying to do in order to divert from the issue. You've got, whatever it is, 600,000 people on the streets of Tel Aviv, or of Israel at the moment, against the judicial reform. So I'm not sure what we're diverting from here. In fact, we're confronting the issue.
What I do
think is that this has not only caused enormous upset within Israel itself, it has caused significant concern internationally, both in the United States and in Europe. And that comes on top of concern, even if that is not expressed.
But then when we see a senior member, I mean a defense minister being fired, excuse me to cut your train of thoughts, but then when we see the defense minister being fired from the government just because he outspoke, let's say, against these reforms because he saw a threat to the country, how does this make us think of this state?
Well, I think we've got to wait and see what happens. There is some suggestion that, on the one hand, Netanyahu may take over the defense portfolio himself, which again is not unprecedented. He's done so in 2018. And there's some suggestion that he may want to postpone or freeze the whole issue till after Israeli Independence Day on the 26th of April, which, if he does, he would be doing exactly what his fired defense minister had proposed.
And Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, crowds have protested the plans to overhaul Zionist judiciary as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited his British counterpart Rishi Sunak in London. Hundreds of demonstrators shouted shame in Hebrew and waved signs calling for the defense of Zionist democracy as Netanyahu arrived at 10 Downing Street on Friday for discussions that focused on the war in Ukraine and concerns about Iran's nuclear program. How do you see this wide protest and these rejections to the reforms that are outreaching even abroad?
Well, these are very troubling times. I think that anyone would be upset if their prime minister went off on a jolly or a diplomatic mission while his country is imploding, which is exactly what Netanyahu did. He's just poured more fuel onto the fire back home. Of course, this is causing a huge headache for President Joe Biden. He's got Ukraine on his desk. He's been told that Russian and nuclear power is moving planes that are designed to fly nuclear weapons to a neighboring country. You've got the nuclear discussions going on with Iran. You've got the nuclear state of Israel, as I said before, imploding. And then also another strategic area that will be causing the Americans great concern by people power is in Pakistan, where there was a gathering in Lahore just a few hours ago of immense proportions. Maybe 500,000 people had gathered. And of course, all of these nuclear states, which Pakistan is another, these are perilous times when you have nuclear states that are in fragile positions. And I'm sure that the anti-nuclear lobby will be very, very concerned and pointing to this, because you've got all these nuclear powers either imploding, their people are uprising, and these are, it's uncharted waters that we're going through at the moment. The previous guest talked well. There was 500,000 protesting in 1982, but that's over the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. It's probably the last time that Israeli human rights activists have come out in such large numbers. But this protest tonight is about a corrupt, fraudulent, morally bereft leader whose actions and the actions of his far-right government are hurting the Israeli people in the pocket. And that, when people start to struggle to put bread on the table, that is when people rise up and, the people will lead on this. And if the leaders don't pay attention or follow, then they will become irrelevant. I think there is a possibility, because the military or sections of the military are furious at the way that the defense minister has just been summarily dismissed. I think that we may see more of a military presence in the Knesset than, say, on the streets of Jenin.
And Mrs. Pippa Cartel from the very beginning was saying that this is not really a major development. It would not really lead to the collapse of the state in Israel. But then Pippa Cartel, since it's not that important, why do we have all these concerns?
I didn't say that. I said that there is no guarantee that it will do that. I mean, we pick up with what James said earlier. Yes, you have all those people on the streets in 1982. It leads to a resignation of a government. It doesn't lead to the collapse of the state. And you've got to draw a differentiation between a government and a state. So it might lead to the resignation of a far-right prime minister, but given who controls Knesset, the chances are that even if Netanyahu goes, and I think he will be going kicking and screaming if he does, I accept what James has said, that he seems to have misjudged the situation on this occasion in the past, but he's come back from the previous falls in his political career as well. So I find it quite difficult to write him off just yet, even though this looks like the biggest test of his political career that we've yet seen. However, even if that happens, it's not a collapse of the state. Obviously, you can always worry if you're a significant other power like the US or like Europe, who are primarily interested in stability, not having the kind of refugee crisis that we saw from neighboring Syria, which has had major impacts upon Europe and so on. So what you tend not to want in your near abroad is anything which is going to destabilize things.
And speaking of destabilization here, we see that even investors are going to be scared away due to this uncertainty and instability in the state. I mean, how serious is this? I mean, overall, when we speak about this situation in general, is this really going to at least harm the potentials of the state of growth and development?
It depends on how long this lasts, and so it may be early days yet. These protests can develop. As James says, we've seen protests have led to the falls of governments and indeed the falls of states in the past, but they don't normally collapse. Or they don't always collapse overnight, and it's whether there is a willingness to maintain the state or not. So the attitude of the military is understandably quite important here. The attitude of the judiciary is probably important too. The attitude of parliamentarians will be important. But at the moment, I think it's definitely a protest against the government and a corrupt far-right prime minister. It's not a protest against the state. Indeed, as I said earlier, they're all waving Israeli flags. They're not protesting the state.
And Mr. James Dawsey, what is the expected scenario to come? I mean, are the protests going to linger on until we see perhaps the resignation of the Prime Minister?
If I can just add something to what my colleague just said, and I totally agree with him. I think there's one indeed writes Netanyahu off at one's peril. But I think there's one difference. We have a far-right government in Israel because no one else was going to form a government with Netanyahu. The last government was formed on the basis of anything but Netanyahu. So, with other words, if this government were to fall, Netanyahu would have a very tough time. And most likely, anyone but Netanyahu would be a major factor in the formation of any new government. In terms of the economic impact of this, I think we're, up until now, sure, there was unrest. People were moving money out of the country. There was uncertainty. I think you're getting one qualitative difference now, which is you're starting to get strikes. So the labor union is talking about a strike. You have medical personnel, doctors and nurses reporting sick because they do not want to, because they want to protest the judicial overhaul that Netanyahu is proposing. And that, of course, will have an economic impact. It will also impact investment decisions, both from domestic sources as well as from foreign sources.
And we see here as the latest development, Mr. James Dawsey, Jordan's parliament has called for expelling the Zionist ambassador in Jordan. How can this lead to more Arab reactions toward the Zionist leadership, which has shown a lack of democracy within the right-wing government of Netanyahu, who's known for his opposition to Arabs in general, Mr. James Dawsey?
Well, I think you've seen fallout in Jordan, where you've had calls for a rupture in diplomatic relations or a reduction of the level of diplomatic relations. You've also seen the same thing in the United Arab Emirates. There were reports last month that at the very moment that the UAE and Israel had launched their first joint military products, an unmanned surveillance and reconnaissance vessel, that the United Arab Emirates was halting acquisition of military equipment from Israel because of the uncertainty in Israel and because of the question of whether or not Netanyahu was in charge of his government. I don't think that what you're going to see at this point, Arab states intervening on the issue of the judicial overhaul. The responses from countries like Jordan and the UAE is not to the issue of judicial overhaul, but it's about the issue of Israeli policy on the West Bank.
Do you agree, Mrs. Yvonne Ridley?
Absolutely. I mean, the Arab states will be watching with interest, but they won't be sharpening their bayonets just yet. They will be very curious about how this is going to unfold. But I think if we look at the relationship with Washington, which has been tested in the 2 years with Biden, Netanyahu was removed from power only to be re-elected, and then he was hit with these corruption charges, and that's when he made the decision to change the makeup of the country's judiciary, and said, of course, the whole purpose of that was to make it more difficult to remove him from office. And
Yes.
as I said, it was like putting a fox in the hen coop. But on Thursday, the White House did issue a statement saying democratic values have always been and must remain a hallmark of the US-Israel relationship. So I think that once Washington loses patience with Tel Aviv, I think that Netanyahu will have his chains yanked. I've got no doubt at all that officials in the Pentagon are already in touch with their Israeli military counterparts. And I think that this time Netanyahu may have bitten off more than he can chew. And I hope that people around the world see the recklessness of voting in far-right governments. They don't work. They cause a great deal of financial instability for ordinary people. And we're seeing this now on the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. There's 150 different protests going on around Israel at the moment, around this tiny little dot in the Middle East.
Mr. James Dorsey, I would like to come back to a statement that was made just now by Dr. Yvonne Ridley, that Netanyahu bit off more than he can chew. How do you foresee, let's say, a way out for Netanyahu from this crisis that he created with his own hands?
Well, the next few hours, I think, or today will tell us. Netanyahu has to act, given that he has just fired his defense minister. The speculation is that that Netanyahu will try and freeze this issue. So, with other words, up until now, there have been compromise formulas that have been put on the table, particularly by the Israeli President Herzog, which Netanyahu has rejected. The sense is that he now will try and get a cooling off period, probably for another 6 or 8 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, till after the Israeli Independence Day on April 26, and then try to push this through again, or opt for a compromise in which there is judicial overhaul, but not to the degree that he would like.
Very nice. Thank you, Mr. James Dorsey, for agreeing to be with us again.
Sorry I have to leave you.
Yes, we understand you have a tight schedule, but thank you for honoring us again. And let me get back to you, Mrs. Pippa Cartel. How do you see a way out from this crisis?
Well, I agree with James that it seems to me that Netanyahu his best bet will be to try and pause things and let the situation calm down, because at the moment there is a momentum.
Well, it seems we're having a connection problem with Pippa Cartel. So let me redirect the question to you, Dr. Yvonne Ridley.
I'm just watching your images at the moment with the Zionist military firing water cannons on the Israeli protesters. And I thought, I bet they aren't the same water cannons where they just pump raw sewage onto the Palestinians. I would imagine that the security forces are having to rein back on how they treat their own protesters, which of course is why it's called the apartheid state.
Absolutely. So technically, with this current crisis, Mrs. Yvonne Ridley, we see that the Zionist entity is actually being quite bare and transparent to the people that it disregards democracy.
Well, they seem to have velvet gloves on at the moment. I don't know if people would agree on this. I mean, I have seen more aggression from police in London dealing with anti-Israeli marches than I've seen here on the streets of Israel. You know, that they seem to be they're not firing rubber bullets or live bullets, and they don't have snipers on the rooftops picking off all of the medical helpers or the journalists covering the event. So anyone wanting to draw parallels, you know, we can see why it is called the apartheid state. As I say, a lot of people will have that feeling of schadenfreude just watching these scenes, but it isn't going to be the end of Israel.
And let me invite Pippa Cartel again to catch up on what was being said.
Well, no, I agree with all of that, and it seems to me that, as I was saying earlier, this could be something where you get a momentum building. So if you look at states where protests have started off and gradually built and eventually overthrown a government or indeed a constitutional order, it's usually been because the forces of law and order have withdrawn, have not contested the streets, and eventually joined in with the protesters. I don't see that happening at this stage, but I think if Netanyahu continues on the course he is, rather than, as James suggested, doing a pause, having a cooling off period, and then trying again, when the momentum of these protests has died down, I think that the situation could become much more serious for him. But and you were raising the point earlier as well about how the US will respond to all of this. Now, given what's going on in the US at the moment with the indictment of Donald Trump and so on, it seems to me that a Democrat president has to be seen to be responding to the kind of attacks on the rule of law and the attacks on democracy in an ally like Israel that Donald Trump is himself being indicted for back in his home country.
And that is one of the reasons, according to one of the protesters, actually, he said that is one of the reasons that the protesters said the government is quite keen to push these judicial overhauls through because they have ministers that have convictions of tax fraud and convictions of racism. So changing the judiciary perhaps is going to make the apartheid state even apparent.
Absolutely. Well, it's about destroying accountability, isn't it? Because if you already control Parliament, if you control the press, then what you need to do is control the judiciary as well. It's the way in which you build totalitarianism by destroying any form of accountability. And so if you look at any totalitarian state, controlling the judiciary is usually one of the first things they go for. And it makes it much harder to hold them to account or indeed to stop them. I mean, it's not just tax fraud, though. I mean, this is one of the points Yvonne keeps on making, that in the end, sometimes that's the only thing you can get these people for. But there's a whole series of other things that Netanyahu and his government have been able to get away with, and so destroying that accountability through the courts and through Parliament and in the electorate is really bad for any form of rule of law, due process, or responsible government, particularly when, as Yvonne's been stressing, so many of the people that they have power over, they treat with such so badly.
And Mrs. Yvonne, Israeli Good Governance Group on Sunday asked the country's Supreme Court to punish Netanyahu for allegedly violating a conflict of interest agreement meant to prevent him from dealing with the country's judiciary while he is on trial for corruption. How do you think the Supreme Court is going to take this? Is it going to take it seriously? Are we going to see the Prime Minister being charged for that?
I think that if these demonstrations continue and then it heads towards mass strike action or some form of general strike, I think that the Supreme Court will have to take the charges or allegations against Netanyahu very seriously. I think there will be some form of capitulation tomorrow. I can't see Netanyahu wanting this to escalate. And also, I can't see the West wanting this to escalate. You know, Israel is their watchdog in the Middle East. And a threat to Israel is a threat to the West. So they won't allow this to happen. But I do think that the despotic rulers in the region will be looking at these scenes in absolute horror, because nothing sends the chill down the spine of a dictator than scenes of people power. And you know, this is how the Arab Spring started, and that contagion went right across North Africa. I can't see it spreading because it's happening inside Israel by Israelis, and most people's attitude will be quite pragmatic and unconcerned. But the dictators in the region, I bet they are not allowing the lives that we are watching now.
Very nice. Let me give you a final word, Pippa Cartel.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but it also illustrates the extent to which we got to be careful about misreading a protest or overemphasizing a protest. If you look at the Arab Spring, some of the number of those protests which ended up leading to genuine regime change was actually fairly limited. I don't think we're talking about regime change here. I think we're talking about protests against a corrupt government, and that I agree with Yvonne that it's likely that we'll see some kind of step back from the confrontation that we're now seeing. The ball is in Netanyahu's court because the protesters have got so far. The question is, you know, what do you do when you've protested? Where do you go from there? They're not. You being in the street doesn't necessarily lead to an overthrow of the government. You don't have the force to overthrow the government unless the military come on side and so on. So at the moment, it's about performance. It's about drawing attention to these kinds of things and hoping that something.
Yes, very nice indeed. Mrs. Pippa Cartel, thank you ever so much for agreeing to be with us. Dr. Yvonne Ridley, again, thank you for being with us, and Mr. James Dawsey, who was with us from Singapore. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on our channel. With this, our special coverage comes to an end. Till next time, take care.